Hi guys, this is the penultimate lesson for module 7. Have a look at the picture for me. What can you see happening and why is it like that? So you should be able to see some variations in the vegetation and maybe the structure of the earth as well to suggest what is happening here. If you do geography, you've probably seen something like this before. If you haven't, then we're going to start from the very beginning anyway, so no drama either ways. Right, so spend a few minutes again, just taking a look, discovering what's happening and deciding why it's like that. So today we're going to be looking at a topic called succession, and this is how both the plants and animals and environment of an ecosystem vary over time. So you can see at the top of this slide, it's linked very heavily to the end of topic 5. Where you started looking at biomass and movement of energy between trophic levels, but also nutrient cycles. So towards the end of the lesson, we're going to start going back to nitrification and things like that. So let's get started at the very beginning. Now, we've been over this loads of times before. Ecosystems are super dynamic. Organisms can move in and out of an ecosystem. As well as that, seeds can be deposited from animals. Pollen can arrive through insects from outside the area as well. They're constantly going to be changing. However, succession is not the result of organisms moving in and out of an area. Instead, succession is defined as follows. The process by which ecosystems change over time as a result of the abiotic factors causing species changes. So remember, abiotic is non-living. So we're not talking about predators and prey here. We're not talking about anything like that. We're instead looking at things like those edaphic factors, the sunlight, the water availability, the things that we looked at a few lessons ago, which seemed to go on forever, but was actually only 5 or 6 separate points. Now, there are 2 different types of succession that we need to know about. The first is primary succession, and this is going to occur on area that's been newly exposed. So maybe some bare rock has cracked open, for example, or perhaps a part of the riverbed has dried up and there's no soil or any other organic carbon-containing material present. The second type of succession is, surprisingly, secondary succession, and this is where we've got soil but no colonising plants or animal species. Now, normally, this is going to be the result of a major disturbance. So normally after things like natural disasters, maybe forest fires, floods, things like that expose some soil but remove all of the organisms from it. However, there is some chance that in that soil there's going to be nutrients, and there also might be things like seeds embedded in the ground. Remember, seeds and things like that are able to travel long distances and lay dormant for quite a long period of time. Now, just to recap that, primary succession is what happens when we've got newly exposed rock or a surface where there's no soil or organic material. Secondary succession is when we're looking to recolonise an area with living species after some kind of event. Now, succession is still happening today. Primary succession is still going on, and it takes hundreds of years for landscapes to become really biodiverse and to have a wide variety of organisms there. Now, primary succession is still going to be occurring in the earth today, and you might be able to see it if you go on a holiday, you go to certain areas. So we've got things like volcanic eruptions, and that lava, the magma that is released, is going to solidify into igneous rock. And that rock has no soil, no organic matter, and therefore primary succession would be occurring there. Likewise, we've got sand being moved around from place to place, longshore drift, if you're particularly keen on your geography, and it creates new sand dunes, new areas for plants to grow that previously won't have had anything there. Silt or mud depositing at river estuaries, the mouths of rivers and things like that, can provide new habitats for lots of worms, potentially flatworms and other sort of aquatic amphibious creatures. And finally, possibly the most significant given the state of global warming at the moment, the retreating or melting of glaciers. So exposing the rock and rubble that they're based on, and that's going to expose a little bit more surface for organisms to live on. As the glaciers retreat as well, they're not going to provide such an extreme surface. So we're going to have a reduced number of extremophiles in these regions. And succession is made up of lots of different steps. Each one of those different steps is known as a seral stage or a sear. And at each stage, we're focusing on key species to identify that tell us that the abiotic factors have changed enough to increase the suitability of that area for survival. Now, when we're talking about succession, actually the one that was potentially the most boring initially, and when we looked at abiotic factors, is now the most important. Those edaphic or soil factors are going to be pivotal to the existence of certain species of plants. And the more plants that we can get in an area, the more likelihood there is that insects are going to come, and insects are going to bring small mammals and so on and so forth. But that's only going to change by abiotic factors. Like the whole predator-prey interaction is going to have absolutely no bearing on the evolution of an ecosystem as a whole. Now, primary succession is really slow. We're starting from ground zero. There's absolutely nothing there. And we're going to start this lesson in a second properly by looking at primary succession from day dot. Secondary succession, though, is a little bit quicker because we're assuming that soil and nutrients are already present. Okay, so secondary succession, remember, occurs after a natural event. So we may still already have some of that organic matter in the ground, and all we need to do is just bring some species in, effectively plant the seeds and make the food for the animals. Now, this is a diagram of succession. As you can see, we've got quite a lot of information here that we're going to go over, so don't worry about it for now. If you did want to draw a diagram to help you with this lesson, this is probably quite a good one to start with, so I would maybe just draw the shapes. I mean, you can start with barren land, that's what we're going to start with, and then maybe label boxes with the pioneer, intermediate and climax community. As you can see though, to the left there's a key. So primary succession is really, really slow. It starts off with that barren land, as we've said. However, secondary succession is going to start around the intermediate community, and you can see here that the colour of the arrows is going to start changing. So the intermediate community almost tees off to form this secondary succession pathway. So we can see in my green circle that I'm highlighting, we've got that land alteration, so due to natural disaster, agriculture, things like that, and we're going to get that process of recolonisation. And regardless of which type of succession we're looking at, either primary or secondary, we are aiming to go from hostile, inhospitable conditions to less hostile and more hospitable conditions. And that transition from hostility to less hostility is going to increase my species diversity and ultimately result in a more biodiverse area. And then remember, the more biodiverse an area, the better it is likely to be able to deal with genetic change or a change in selection pressure. So we're going to start at Sear 1, or the first seral stage, and that's the pioneer community. You know, pioneers are people that go and find new places or they start new things. And this is where we get pioneer species starting to colonise or grow on an inhospitable environment. If you recall, that inhospitable environment that we're talking about is bare rock or an exposed surface that doesn't have anything growing on it, with no soil, no organic matter. And these pioneer species are going to be arriving through either the wind or via birds, so carried in their mouth, as either spores or seeds. And the plants that we're developing or growing as our pioneer species are going to be those that form very shallow lawns. So things like algae, things like lichen that can coat surfaces of exposed rock and still grow, because that's how they want to grow, and very small mossy plants. And these pioneer community species generally have very similar adaptations. So they're able to produce large quantities of seeds, and they can spread those around quite easily to be deposited and make their reach slightly wider in that area. Additionally, those seeds, those mass seeds that they produce, are going to be able to germinate really quickly. So in that, we get rapid proliferation, we got more plants taking over that rocky area, which means that we're going to get more seeds and more plants and more seeds and more plants. And you see it carries on and on and on and on and on. And these plants obviously have to be extremophiles. The areas that they're living in are going to lack nutrients. They're not going to have a viable water supply. So they've got to be able to survive in those conditions. And for that reason, they might actually be xerophytes in some cases. And remember, the xerophytes from Module 3 are plants that are able to survive in areas without water. They've got those adaptations. Things like the rolled leaves, things like the hairy leaves, things like the deep roots, lots of things that are going to enable them to survive as well. Now over time, that rock is going to be worn away as plants start to grow on it, that algae, that lichen. And over time, that soil kind of substance is more just going to be like a rocky sediment. It's unable to support life. There's nothing in there that's going to be useful for a species. However, as those pioneer species start to die and start to decompose, they're going to start putting some small organic molecules, maybe some carbon-containing molecules, into the soil. And this forms something called a soil starter. It's called humus. It's not hummus like the chickpea paste that some of you probably enjoy. Humus, 1M. Now this new soil, the humusy mixture, is going to be able to support more plant species, slightly more complex species that need roots. And these are called secondary colonizers. And they're called secondary colonizers because they come after the pioneer species, which would realistically be a primary colonizer, but we just call it a pioneer because it was there first. And these secondary colonizers are now able to grow because that organic matter has started to deposit things like minerals, and also now that it's got a slightly more open texture, it's able to hold water a little bit better as well. So we can see here that death and decomposition of the pioneer species starts the process of mineralization of the soil. So depositing the good stuff into the soil to help plants grow. Now these secondary colonizers are often things like mosses, and the mosses are going to be slightly more complex than those algae, that lichen that we spoke about for the pioneer species, and they're going to arrive as spores. We can start also seeing some kind of animal species moving into the area during the intermediate community as well. So pioneer species, those algae, the lichen, things like that, could start becoming food sources for consumers, and we start building a food chain now. And as our conditions start to improve, so those secondary colonizers maybe die, they're going to deposit more organic matter. So we'll just make a note of that here. So conditions improve, we're going to increase the organic matter in the soil. Soil, and then we're going to increase the water availability, or the amount of water that soil can hold. I hope that's how you spell availability. I'm doing it as I'm talking. We're going to get even more complex species. Big ferny plants, those with big vascular leaves, are now going to be able to come into our area. And these ferns are what we call tertiary colonizers. And the ferns as well are quite waxy. So they've got a thick waxy cuticle to prevent water loss. That's one of those xerophytic adaptations, remember, the ones that we spoke about a while ago. And the thicker that waxy cuticle, the further the distance between the outside air and the spongy mesophyll layer. So we're increasing our diffusion distance, we're minimising the water loss from those leaves. Now through each seral stage, each layer of this intermediate community, we're going to continue eroding our rock. So we're going to continue getting some rocky substrate into our soil, but we're also going to increase that mass of organic material. And remember, we're increasing the nutrients in our soil, and over time, as more stuff dies, it's also going to get deeper. Now, as our conditions, our environment, our abiotic factors, things like wind, light, water availability, as all of those become slightly more favourable, seeds will start being deposited from animals flying over or moving through the area, and we might start seeing some small flowering plants, things that are going to give fruit or vegetables, or they're going to have nice pollen that's attractive to other species. We might also see some small shrubs and small trees that provide habitats. You can see now that we've developed from that very basic lichen covering the rock surface to now looking at areas where other organisms, animals for example, can start to survive as well. And at each of those serial stages, the animals that we see coming into the community, the plants that we see growing in the community, are going to become better adapted to the conditions. And if we've got, and we've spoken about out competition before, if we've got a better suited species to that environment, so maybe tree A is better at growing in this dry environment than tree B, we start getting tree A to become a dominant species. Now, the dominant species is not necessarily the biggest one, it is instead the most abundant. And that means that it's the most prevalent, it's the most amount of those plants by mass. So you could have one big oak tree and it could weigh like 4 tons, but it doesn't mean that it's the most dominant just because it's the biggest. Instead, we could have lots and lots and lots of little shrubs that weigh much more than 4 tons, but coat a more vast space in that ecosystem, and they would be the dominant species then. And finally, we get to Seer 3, the climax community. So this is our final step in primary succession. So this is where our community starts to stabilise a little bit, and that stability is really important because it means that there's going to be very little change. It means that the conditions are the same, and that organisms know how to respond. Now here we've got only a few dominant species, so maybe a few plants and a few animals, but remember that the species is going to be dependent on things like the climate. So if it's a warm area, then you're not going to get very many furry animals, for example. And likewise, in the cold, you might not probably get very many hairless animals. And it's really, really important to remember that just because we're at a climax community, and climax implies that it's like the highest or the peak, we don't have necessarily the greatest amount of biodiversity. So over time, the biodiversity is likely to peak at the intermediate community where lots of animals and plants are like, what's this new area? But over time, we're going to get more out competition, we're going to get more dominant species. And that's really key to know, that the more successful the dominant species, the less biodiverse the area is. So if we think back to the example of the oak tree versus the shrubs, if the shrubs manage to wrap their roots around anything else that's around, they're going to effectively take out all of the other plants in the area. They're going to be really, really dominant, really, really successful in that ecosystem. Now, all of this PowerPoint has really been focusing on plant succession, so looking at how plant species arrive at an ecosystem and then distribute themselves throughout that space over time, and how that complexity increases. At the same time, we see concurrent, so at the same time, succession occurring in animals. And as you can see here, primarily once we've got that pioneer species, we've got quite a low organic matter in the ground, we're going to have some worms and insects coming in to the ecosystem, and that's just because they're able to consume or shelter in the lichen. So they're using that lichen, those pioneer species, as a food source but also a habitat, but they're not very complex themselves. However, when we get to the secondary and tertiary and moving towards a climax community, organisms and plants that are mobile or motile have to move in from neighbouring areas. So they've got to be a migratory process after a period of exploration in that area. So the animals will have to come in, see what they like about the area, decide if they want to live there. Obviously, they're not going to have a conversation, but they might see that there's lots of resources that aren't being tapped into yet. And eventually, over time, they're going to move the populations in. So it's going to be much, much slower. And this is especially pertinent if we've got some kind of geographical isolation. So maybe this new community is at the bottom of a valley after a mountain had cracked open. Okay, now the key thing to note with this animal succession is only once a suitable food source has been established and plants are able to provide a suitable habitat. So it might be hiding, it might be a soft enough soil to make a den, it might be soft enough soil to be able to burrow. And at the same time, we need things like fruits on the trees and things like that to make bigger, more complex organisms coming in. Then we start getting those secondary and tertiary consumers. We're not going to get anything more complex than worms and insects and small invertebrates until the plants are basically consumable enough to be worth it. However, despite climax community being the overall goal of an ecosystem, sometimes we can have situations where an ecosystem is prevented from reaching this point, and this is called a plagioclimax. Okay, and this is when we're stopping succession, but it has to be artificial, so it's normally human induced. And we've got a few examples just behind this orange box, but you could pause now if you wanted to and have a think about them. So the first way that we're going to stop a climax community being reached is by trampling or grazing. So if we've got a field of cows or some sheep that are there and eating all of the ground, all of the plants on the ground, all of the leaves on the shrubs, lots of our areas are not going to be able to develop any further than a grassland. Likewise, if we move any existing vegetation and start planting crops, then we're changing the biodiversity from what would naturally be there to what we would like as humans, and instead our climax community starts to become those crops. And we don't even say it's a climax community because it's not even very biodiverse, it's just a final community. And finally, burning as a means of forest clearance. So things like where they burn down the Amazon. So what they're doing is they're burning down the Amazon to make space for food and to hold animals in Brazil. And what they're doing there is they're effectively inducing secondary succession. So we're just going to burn the entire forest or burn a section of the forest and start off with a nice nutrient-dense ash, nutrient-dense soil substrate that we can then grow other things on, and that links to points 1 and 2 above as well. Now these are some questions for you guys to do. We've got quite a few marks worth here, 2, 4, 6, 12, 13 marks worth of questions. So spend about 15 minutes on here. You're going to need to pause this video now. You're going to need to write your answers. You're going to need to do some research and then play again when you're ready to go through them. All right, perfect. So hopefully that wasn't too challenging. Hopefully the answers were quite, or Google was quite forthcoming with the answers. So these sand dunes show an example of primary succession. We're starting off with a completely dry, arid land. We've said about this, the sand is maybe moved in from another dune. And some examples of the pioneer species might be something like sea couch grass. Okay, something that grows in the sea but has been able to seed itself in the sand and start growing there. And the adaptations of this early plant species, maybe this pioneer species, are here. So it might have deep tap roots. Now what that means, if we do a horrible diagram, is that if this is the sand layer, top of the sand layer, tap roots come down and then spread really wide. And in doing that, they're able to reach a wider area in order to obtain any moisture that's available. They might be quite small or short. They might have a low profile. So that means that they're less likely to be affected by crosswinds. They're probably just going to be able to just crush themselves into the sand a little bit. And then we've got our waxy leaves. They're going to retain moisture by increasing the diffusion distance. We've said that already this lesson, where we've got that thicker layer on the outside of the leaf, and it means that we've got a further distance between that spongy mesophyll layer and the outside environment to stop as much transpiration. We're going to have a high salt tolerance. We're by the sea. We're probably not going to be too far away from the sea either. So we need to be able to cope with maybe salt water moving into the area and being in the soil. And if you've done any other research, maybe your example for 2A wasn't sea couch grass, you might have chosen some other properties, examples, things like that. So if you're not too sure, just ask and let me know and we can go through them together. Now, as ecologists, because that's what we are now, we love a bit of marram grass. It's an excellent example of a xerophyte. But what it does in this community is it starts to stabilise the dune. So marram grass has got really, really deep tap roots. And what it does with those roots is it starts to trap the sand. So it stops movement of sand across, so we don't get any more kind of drifting of sand. We don't get any more chance of that sand that is now growing plants to move and form another exposed area, for example. And obviously, much like the lichen, much like the algae that we spoke about in primary succession, nutrients are added to the sand as marram grass die, and that means that the sand is going to become more organic. And therefore, more organic means that we're going to get more nutrients, and it's just going to be better overall for new organisms to move in and colonise the area. Now, question 4 was quite tricky, I thought. Explain how the abiotic factors on a sand dune are going to change over time. And there were quite a few answers you could have had. It was a 4-marker. So you might have said that the environment becomes less alkaline or it becomes less salty because more non-salt water is present, or that the sand is able to hold on to some more water. The presence of nutrients is going to increase the soil depth or maybe the amount of humus. And the plants are going to experience less windy conditions. They're going to start shielding each other. They're going to potentially move up the beach a little bit more as that humus becomes slightly deeper. And any other suitable explained factor, so something that you have given a reason for, is absolutely fine. Now the final question is, why is the biodiversity not potentially as large in the climax community? And that is because smaller species or less dominant species are just out-competed. They're going to compete for things like light, water and space, and they're just not good enough. It's the way the world is sometimes. So give yourself a score out of 13. Hopefully it wasn't too challenging. I would like to think that you will have all got at least 10, especially as you are researching it. But if you're not too sure about any of these, let me know and we can go through it again one-on-one on Teams. So now it's your turn again. Have a go at warming to succession on page 222 to 223 and self-assess using the photos of the answers at the back of the book. You're going to need to pause and then play again when you have completed that task. As you well know, we always finish off with some exam questions, and you can see that these ones are for 7A, very much linked to today's lesson, but for 7B, very much linked to the end of topic 5. So, have a go. These are 4 marks, should take you about 5 minutes. It's to describe the differences, not explain what they mean. Describe the differences between the following biological terms. So, a pioneer community and a climax community, and then decomposition and denitrification. Pause and play again when you are ready. Explain the differences between nitrogen fixation and nitrification. And I know it says a total of 8, but we've only done 6 of those marks. So here we've got the answers to the first question. The difference between pioneer species and climax community. I'm just not going to read them out. You can read them. AVP is any other valid point. And they've put some examples over on the right-hand side. And you might want to have had some of those. That's absolutely fine. It's a maximum of 2 marks. So, judge which ones you think you got. If you didn't get 2, then please correct them or add some detail into your answers. But notice that all mark points have to be comparative. So, earlier, greater, lower, less. lower. Okay, you need to have that comparative point, not just saying pioneers arrived first, because you haven't said anything about the climax community. For question 2, or B, the decomposition and denitrification comparison. Again, this is a comparison point. So you need to say this is this, but this is this. I'll pause again, or you can pause. And then the final one is nitrogen fixation versus nitrification. And if you're not too sure about this, let me know and I can give you access to my Module 5 lessons as well. So I hope you found that useful. You should get a score out of 6 for the end of the lesson. If you are struggling with anything, maybe you're not too confident in this topic, let me know. We can have a look at some exam questions together. If any of you are super geography nerds though, talk to them. They'll probably know more than I do. All right, see you next time, guys, for the last lesson of Module 7. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.